Okay, cool. All right, so today I'll just be going over a brief introduction to cell biology. So today's topic is cell biology. My name is Bill, and I'll be your instructor for the biology course. So as a brief introduction to this course, I'm your instructor. That's my email if you want to email me with questions. And basically in this course, you can expect to learn some basic concepts in biology, especially with a focus on genetics and evolution. So in the next few lessons, you should expect some courses on genetics and evolution, and today we will just be going over some cell biology prerequisites. Okay, so as a brief overview for today, we'll be going over some basic chemistry and prerequisites to understanding biology, and as well as some common organic molecules and their properties. Then I'll be going over the parts of a eukaryotic cell and some basic anabolic and catabolic pathways that you may need to know. Oh yeah, by the way, if you have any questions, just feel free to message me in Q&A, or um, if I'm going too fast or anything, just tell me. Okay. So 1 second. Okay. So first we'll be going over some basic chemistry and prerequisites that you may need to know before you begin your pursuit of biology. So first of all, it's important to know that valence electrons inside of an atom or a molecule determine the chemical reactivity of the particular atom that you're looking at. And for the sake of biology, you will only be dealing with some of the very light elements, for example, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen. These are all elements with pretty low atomic numbers and atomic masses. So the chemistry of biology deals mainly with these sort of light elements, and they're mainly in the first 3 rows of the periodic table. So in this case, you can, mostly ignore the transition metals, and in this case, valence electrons in the group number generally determine what kinds of bonds you'll be seeing in a particular atom. So for you find recording of the class, recordings of the class as well as the PowerPoints and notes and everything, I think will be uploaded to the website. Try. Yeah. Okay. So the basic idea here is that we want to see several kinds of bonds that exist in a biological construct. So the several kinds of bonds you may need to know about, first of all, covalent bonds. So in a lot of biological molecules, covalent bonds make up the front of the molecule, most of the molecule. And the idea behind a covalent bond is that at a simple level, electrons are shared between atoms. And these are the strongest kinds of bonds, and the atoms are also the most close together. So you can see on the right here that there are a lot of functional groups, which are just, you may see these commonly in chemical structures, but one thing that's in common with all of these groups is that they're formed with covalent bonds. So covalent bonds are generally represented in shorthand by a line. Yeah. The next kind of bond you may want to know about is an ionic bond, which is essentially a bond that occurs due to electrostatic interactions. And what that means is that 2 different atoms that have different charges are attracted to each other because a negative charge is attracted to positive charge and vice versa. So in this picture below, you can see the sodium and fluorine atom. It's a classic example of ionic bonds. Initially, all atoms are not charged, but because some atoms are highly electronegative, which means that they like to take electrons, occasionally, in order to complete their outer valence shell, the most outermost shell, some atoms will not just form bonds, like in covalent bonds where they share electrons, they will completely strip another atom of its electrons. So in this case, the sodium atom loses its outermost electron, you can see at the very top, and donates it to fluorine. That way, both fluorine and sodium have a completely completed outer valence shell. So these ionic bonds are commonly found in proteins and some other um, they're found in some other organic molecules, and they're important to bond chemistry. And lastly, the different kinds of bonds you'll need to know about are some weak interactions, namely hydrogen bonds and London forces. So a hydrogen bond is basically a bond which is formed between a hydrogen atom and a electronegative atom such as nitrogen or oxygen or fluorine. So these are generally more electronegative atoms than hydrogen. And essentially what happens is that because hydrogen is very weakly electronegative, meaning it doesn't hold on to its electron very strongly, it tends to have a partial positive charge when it's bonded to an atom such as oxygen. This is called polarity of a bond. You may have learned about this in the previous course, Heming's chemistry course. I'm not sure if you went over this. But basically, in some sorts of bonds, there are electronegative differences, which causes a polarity difference between the two atoms. So in this case, it's common to see that hydrogen will have a partial positive charge, and oxygen or other electronegative atoms will have a partial negative charge. And as a result, there will be a weak interaction between them, which is very similar to ionic bonds, except that the charges involved are much, much smaller. So some common chemical groups that occur in biological molecules, which may cause this weak bond are, as you can see in the functional groups, hydroxyl groups are very commonly found because they oxygen is highly electronegative but the hydrogen has a partial positive charge. So in this case, hydrogen is attracted to like the oxygens of water or oxygens of other hydroxyls. Okay. You can also see this in the carboxyl group and the amino group. In an amino group, the hydrogens are also have partial positive charge and the nitrogen has a partial negative charge. London forces are a different kind of bond. They're also known as van der Waals forces, and they're basically a kind of force that happens between any kind of atom, and they occur due to how an atom's layout is. I'm not sure if you guys have learned this, excuse me, in your science classes in school, but because atoms are composed completely of protons and neutrons, as well as electrons. Protons and electrons have charge to them. But in the quantum model of an atom, I'm sure you've seen in your school a like sort of orbital diagram where it looks like protons and neutrons form a central nucleus and then the electrons orbit around them in a sort of like planetary fashion, sort of looks like planets. That's called the Bohr model, but it's actually not very accurate. It's actually completely incorrect. A real atom looks a little bit more like a ball, or you can think of it as a central nucleus with a cloud around it. And electrons take the form a little bit more like a cloud than a particle. You can think of it more like a cloud. And what happens is that at any given time, there's a probability, you can determine a probability for where an electron is located or where a certain particle is located. And because of this, at any given time, there may be a charge imbalance in the atom. It's not a perfectly spread out cloud, okay? So this means that there are charge imbalances in each atom. And because of these charge imbalances, there may occasionally be bonds or weak, very, very weak interactions between any sort of atom. And these are called London forces or van der Waals forces. These are very important to biology because in many organisms use these to, for example, geckos. Maybe if you've ever seen a gecko outside, I don't know where y'all live, but I live in Texas and we see like small green lizards and geckos everywhere on the ground, especially during the summer. So anoles and lizards, they can walk straight up walls, but how they do this has nothing to do with glue. There's no chemicals. It actually works based on London forces. And essentially what happens is that because the gecko's feet have so many hairs on them, the London forces, individually, they're very weak, but together, there's a huge amount of London forces because a gecko's foot has so many hairs. And as a result, they have such a strong force on them that they can walk straight up a wall. Excuse me, give me 1 second. All right, sorry about that. Someone just rang my doorbell. Okay, so you're talking about gecko skin. And gecko skin is very unique in that because of the van der Waals or London forces that exist, um, they're able to walk straight up walls. And you can see this actually in a lot of other organisms. Velcro, like the Velcro shoes you use to in your sneakers, are also based off this principle. And so are some other biological constructs, such as protein, how proteins fold. So all these forces are very important to biology. And it's important to realize that biology fundamentally, it's a science that's based in chemistry and physics. So a lot of the things you'll see in biology have like chemical explanations or physical explanations. Okay, so besides these bonds, as a prerequisite, you may want to know a couple of important chemical groups because they come up very often in biology in that there are a lot of molecules that have these groups. So on the right, you can see a table, and these are some of the very important functional groups you need to know. And out of these, they all have their own unique properties. So hydroxyl groups, I already mentioned, tend to form hydrogen bonds. And methyl groups are a kind of group that is composed of a carbon bound to a hydrogen, and it's actually a nonpolar bond. And this means that because carbon and hydrogen have similar electronegativities, there's no like charge difference in between them when they have a covalent bond. And so as a result, it's very nonpolar. There are also some other groups you may find. Um, in the subsequent slides, you may see several organic molecules, and you'll find a lot of these organic groups, and I'll try to point them out as we go along. Carboxyl, carbonyl groups are very particular to a kind of organic molecule known as sugars or carbohydrates. And amino groups and carboxyl groups, they're very well known in proteins, for example. Phosphates are found in they can be found in nucleotides, which are components of nucleic acids, and sulfhydryl groups. They can be found in proteins. Okay, so besides some of these groups and the bonds, you also have to know a little bit about chemical reactions before proceeding in this course. So generally speaking, a chemical reaction occurs when two or more reactants, which are on the left side of the equation, bonds are broken, and because of a chemical difference in energy or free energy, basically bonds rearrange within the atoms. No atoms are lost or gained during the reaction, so conservation of mass. But energy may be released or stored in the bonds based on free energy differences in the reactions. And you'll see a lot of chemical reactions throughout biology in which thermochemistry or like a difference in entropy is highly, highly important to how the reactions actually occur. So we'll be seeing this in subsequent slides where I talk about chemical reactions occurring in the electron transport chain, in respiration, in DNA replication, and many other sorts of pathways. Okay, so we're just going to stop right here on this slide, and I'm going to give you a quick Q&A to see if y'all understand. And if you have any questions, once again, just feel free to give me, ask me a question through Q&A thing. Okay, so let's make a poll. Okay. Oh, maybe this is, hey Rich, I don't think I have the, I don't know if you're there, but I don't think I have the capability to make polls. Only open them. Okay, by any chance, I can just ask some questions and then y'all can respond for yourself and see if the question or the answer that you got was the same as the answer I give. Okay, so the first question I'd like to ask is, what is the importance of covalent bonds in biology and why uh, do we need to know about them before we're proceeding in the course? And I'll just give y'all 10 seconds to think about that and then I'll type out the answer so you can see it. Okay, the answer is that covalent bonds are found throughout all kinds of organic molecules, pretty every much every kind of organic molecule you'll see. And yeah, so we're just studying them right now so we can understand a little bit more about what we are about to encounter throughout studying cell biology, genetics, whatever it may be. Okay, let's move on. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some common organic molecules that you might find throughout any living organism, whether it be a bacteria or your dog. Okay, so there are four main classes that you need to know about. There are other kinds of organic molecules, but most fall into these four classes. So first, you need to know a little bit about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are a class of organic molecules which contains molecules such as sugars, starches, and cellulose, and some other sorts of fibers. So you may know carbohydrates best as sugars, and this includes several kinds of different sugars, including like table sugar, which is sucrose. That's a disaccharide. Or you may know carbohydrates as the kind of carbohydrates you find in starches, whether if you're making pasta or using flour to bake bread, those are all carbohydrates. And you may also know it as cellulose. Believe it or not, the clothes you wear, if you're wearing cotton clothes or cotton balls, they're also carbohydrates. And they're actually made of the same subunits that you'll find that make table sugar. So carbohydrates are chemically, they look like a ring, like this you'll see on the right in this table. The simple unit or the monomer of this class of organic molecules is called a monosaccharide. And it just means like one unit. It's like a single sugar. And the most common you may hear about is like glucose or galactose. Um, and they generally take the form of a ring. And these individual subunits can be grouped together to form a polymer, which is like a long chain of these, which you can see to the right, such as starch or cellulose. The next class of organic molecules that you'll probably want to know about is lipids. So lipids includes a wide variety of um, insoluble in water substances. So this includes like fats, waxes, and oils. And they all share some similar properties. They're not as similar in like chemical appearance as carbohydrates, but they share some properties. For example, they're all insoluble in water, which means that if you try to put like an oil or a fat or a wax in water, it won't dissolve and it won't mix. So this property is because they have a large amount of, as you can see from the previous slide, they have a large amount of methyl groups. And in this lower like left-hand corner of the table, all these white balls symbolize a methyl. So methyl groups are nonpolar, and because of the um, interactions between nonpolar and polar groups, um, the lipids are unable to be dissolved in water. So if you ever try to like mix vegetable oil with water, it'll settle on the layer above. It won't dissolve within the water like a sugar would, right? And lipids, although they're structurally, there are a lot of kinds, they may take the form of rings, as you may see in some, if you learned about in chemistry, things like benzene or cyclohexane. Those are all also nonpolar molecules, and they those sort of ring structures, we call them aromatic structures in biology, there also may be lipids. So for example, steroids are a form of lipid, which are formed from four rings. And the most common steroid, which you may know about, is cholesterol. They may also take the form of, like, for example, triglycerides, which are formed from long chains of fatty acids, which have a lot of methyl. And waxes are probably the most strange kinds of lipids in that they have a very non-regular structure. They may just be very, very long chains of carbons and hydrogens. So lipids are probably the most diverse in terms of like structure, but they all have some similar properties. Next, you'll want to know a little bit about proteins. So proteins are the most important molecule that you'll probably need to know about in biology by far. And that's because they carry out the entirety of what it means to be alive or what life is about. So whatever structure or function or whatever thing you think about associated to life, there's probably a protein associated with it that carries it out. For example, your hair, right, is formed completely out of, or nearly completely out of the protein known as keratin. Or your eyes, what makes them transparent is a protein known as crystalline. And proteins also carry out all sorts of functions, such as digestion. If you're wondering how your food gets digested and turns into energy, it's because of a protein. Or how sweat is excreted out of your sweat glands, or how lipids are produced on the surface of your skin. These are all actions that happen due to proteins. Even movement. If you're wondering how you run, how you manage to breathe, or how you can move at all, it's due to proteins. So proteins are the most diverse class of organic molecules, not in terms of their structure, but in terms of their function and utility. So the fundamental unit of a protein is called an amino acid, and it's composed of a central carbon, which has four things bound to it, which is a hydrogen, an amino group, a carboxyl group, and a side chain, or also known as R group. You can see in this table here, the R group symbolizes the side chain. And basically, amino acids are bound together covalently to form a long chain of amino acids known as a polypeptide. And many polypeptides, or one polypeptide, can be folded in a certain way to form a protein. Finally, the last form of organic molecule that we'll be looking at is a nucleic acid. So nucleic acids are a very special form of organic molecules because they're a little bit different from other classes we see here in that they're used to store information. So nucleic acids, I'm sure you all know about DNA, right, is a double helix structure. There's also RNA, and they're all composed of individual subunits called nucleotides. And basically, these molecules are used to store information. Okay, that's it for the common organic molecules. Do you guys have any questions? Not. And if y'all have any questions, I think y'all are free to like ask in the chat if you have any questions, or give me a Q&A. Okay, so moving on, if y'all don't have any questions, we're going to go over some parts of a eukaryotic cell. So building off all the previous things I've talked about, now we will look at how all these things come together to create something that appears alive, right? So a cell is the basic unit of life. It's the smallest thing that you can consider living, and it carries out every single thing that's required to be considered alive. So even as a little kid, y'all probably can differentiate between what is like alive and what isn't. Like a rock is not alive, but a blade of grass is, right? But in reality, what scientists call life, or what you call life, is really just a very, very complex series of chemical reactions, right? So in this case, a cell is just, you can think of it as a giant ball of molecules. Well, it's not that giant, it's actually very small, but it's a ball of molecules which are ordered in a special way and carry out a lot of chemical reactions, right? And that's basically the entirety of biology, right? It's one giant chemical reaction. But in the case of a eukaryotic cell, cells are structured in a way that makes it easier for them to carry out certain chemical reactions, okay? And they're very diverse in how they do this. So the individual subunit of a cell is called an organelle, and it carries out individual processes, very similar to in a human, how organs carry out different processes, right? In a human, the stomach may carry out the process of digestion. Likewise, in a cell, something like the mitochondria carries out the process of breaking down organic molecules, right? So the cell has its individual organelles, which are used to carry out its functions, okay? Okay, so now I'll go over, now that we have a big picture of what a cell is, I'll go over some of the individual parts that you may need to know about. So a eukaryotic cell, which is the kind of cell that you'll be dealing with most often, contains some organelles that are vital to its survival, right? So the one that's most notable, or the one that you can probably see the easiest, is the plasma membrane. And that's just the name for the covering on the outside of the cell. It's what defines what is inside the cell and what is outside the cell, okay? And the plasma membrane is composed of lipids. So it's composed of these molecules that are very similar to this triglyceride, um, bottom middle column. They're very similar, but they have two fatty acid chains instead of three, and they're called phosphoglyceride, right? So they compose the cell membrane, and basically the cell membrane is the boundary of the cell. If the cell is a city, you can think of the plasma membrane as sort of like the walls of a city, or if it was a castle, the walls of the castle, right? And inside of the cell, there contains a fluid known as cytoplasm. And basically, cytoplasm is the fluid inside the cell and all the organelles inside of it. So it's just a general term for everything inside of the cell. And inside the cytoplasm, you'll find organelles such as the nucleus. So just quickly going over each of these organelles, I'll just basically state what they're used for. So the nucleus stores information. It also carries out the instructions inside the cell. You can think of it as an information center, or the CEO of the cell. The mitochondria breaks down organic molecules. It's basically a sort of factory that takes organic molecules such as sugars and turns them into energy, which can be stored in the form of ATP. And ribosomes are small subunits. They're not actually considered organelles, but they're very small protein subunits that are used to make more proteins. And the Golgi apparatus is it's a bunch of compartments made by the same material as a plasma membrane, but it looks like a bunch of stacks on top of each other, or like sacks, right? And the function is to basically package a lot of molecules and send them to other areas in the cell or outside of the cell. The smooth and rough endoplasmic reticulum are organelles that surround the nucleus, and they're also kind of look like sacs. And their function is basically to synthesize a lot of molecules. The smooth ER synthesizes lipids mainly, and the rough ER mainly synthesizes proteins. In plant cells, which are also kind of eukaryote, there are three more organelles, or two mainly, that you know about, that are found in plant cells but not in animal cells. And that's a cell wall and a chloroplast. So the cell wall is like a rough covering on the outside of a plant cell, which is made of cellulose mainly in plants. And the chloroplasts are a very important organelle to plants that basically take light energy and convert it into chemical energy. So that's a basic overview of the organelles. And one thing is an important thing to realize when you're talking about biology in general is that there's a lot of information to take in, but it's important to realize that you have to get the general picture first, get a big picture first. The individual like concepts that I'm talking about right now, it's not that important to memorize. You don't need to just like try to memorize everything I'm saying, but it's important to get the big picture, the big ideas, such as like a cell is the basic unit of life, or individual organelles carry out processes in a cell. Later, if you need to know about them, you can study them, sure, but knowing the big picture is the most important thing. So try to get a grasp on that. Okay. Now I'm going to go over a few of the basic anabolic and catabolic pathways that you'll need to know about before we dive a little bit into genetics. So anabolic and catabolic pathways, anabolic and catabolic are two really fancy words that basically mean breaking down and building up pathways. So an anabolic pathway is a building up pathway. So it means that we're going to take some molecules and mash them together to make a bigger molecule, basically. And a catabolic pathway is the exact opposite. We're going to take a big molecule like a sugar, we're going to break it apart and get some energy, okay? So one of the most important pathways that is found in every cell is a pathway called respiration. And this is a catabolic pathway, which means we're breaking down a molecule. And the purpose of respiration is that we're going to take an organic molecule, like a sugar. The most basic form is usually glucose, right? And we're going to break down the chemical bonds and turn it into a form of energy which we can use. And that's the basic idea behind respiration. The actual process of respiration is very complicated. It occurs in three main processes known as glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation, or the electron transport chain. So the basic idea here is that we're going to take the sugar or any other organic molecule, such as glucose, and you're going to continually oxidize it. And what that means is you're going to take away the hydrogens essentially and put them into energy, like energy molecules, like ATP, bottom right one. And eventually, if you oxidize and break down the glucose molecule enough, you'll get carbon dioxide. And this is the reason why when you exhale, carbon dioxide is released, right? Okay, so ATP, I've been talking a lot about how the goal of this cellular process is to form energy or to get energy in a usable form, but it's stored mainly as a molecule called ATP, and it stands for adenosine triphosphate. And just as a quick quiz, I want you guys to put into the chat right now, what kind of organic molecule is ATP? You guys remember from the previous slide. You guys put that into the chat right. Okay, I'll give you all answers. Okay, I don't know if y'all are there, but the answer to the question is that ATP is a nucleotide, so it's part of the nucleic acid group of molecules. Okay, so now that we've gone over the big picture of respiration, I hope it's a little bit easier for you guys to understand, because getting the big picture is what's really important here, right? The individual reactions of respiration are like extremely complicated. Like glycolysis alone, there are like 10 reactions that you need to know, and each of them have their own enzyme that carries it out, their own reactants and products, but that's not really an important thing here. The important thing to realize is that respiration takes an organic molecule, oxidizes it to carbon dioxide, and takes the energy and puts into ATP, which is usable by the cell, okay? The next kind of pathway that you'll need to know about, which is the most important for genetics, is a protein synthesis pathway. So I've talked a lot about proteins and them being the most important kind of organic molecule that you need to know about. But how are proteins actually made? Well, the answer is that they're made by a complex, a protein RNA complex called the ribosome. And basically, they're composed of individual amino acids, and the ribosome links those amino acids together. but the amino acids, there are 20 of them, and they can be linked together in many different kinds of ways. So the way by which the cell knows how to link together the correct amino acids is by using a molecule called mRNA, which stands for messenger RNA. And it's produced by a process called transcription from DNA. And basically, mRNA tells the ribosome what amino acids to put together and where. And as a result, the finished linking together of the amino acids. Someone raise their hand. Let's see. Okay, well, whoever raised their hand, if you have a question, just put it into the Q&A. Okay, so basically the idea here is that proteins are synthesized based on information given by the DNA. And this is extremely important to pretty much the entirety of biology, and it's called gene expression. So genes, DNA, don't directly carry out the actions that they enforce with like their own organic molecules. They basically conscript other kinds of organic molecules to do it for them, and especially proteins. Okay. The last kind of pathway you'll need to know about, this is an anabolic pathway, is called DNA replication. And basically, it's the concept of how cells manage to store their DNA and information and continually replicate it. So DNA is the information in cells, but information is needed in order to further life, right? And in order to do this, if a cell is going to replicate, they need to replicate their information as well. And they need to replicate it very accurate, right? As because DNA is a double stranded helix, which each strand is complementary to the other, you may find it like immediately apparent that the most simple way by which the cell can replicate its DNA is by splitting the two strands and synthesizing another strand of DNA alongside each of the two separated strands. And this is the basic idea behind DNA replication. From one strand of DNA, you can produce two strands, which are exactly identical to the first in every way. And this process is carried out in the nucleus, and the unit is the nucleotide. Sorry, excuse me. Okay. So this was just a really, really, really brief introduction to cell biology. Cell biology is an extremely huge field. It's probably one of the largest fields of science, period. But because of this, I just gave a very brief introduction to some things that you need to know in order to continue to learn biology. It's important to realize that the amount of information in biology is ridiculously massive. No one person knows everything, right? But it's more important to know a little bit such that you can continue to learn and understand some more concepts if you want to learn them, rather than trying to learn everything, right? Or memorize everything. So as a few concluding statements, you need to know that pathways are extremely essential to biological function in general. I've mentioned 3 pathways already, but there are a lot of other pathways in biology that are essential to how the cell functions or the human functions, right? And finally, you need to remember that cells are the unit of life. They're the basic unit, and everything comes down to the cell. And that's one of the reasons why cell biology is such an important discipline. So now that we're done with the slides, we're going to play a quick game of quizzes, just so we can see where y'all are at and see if you guys understand. Okay. So quizzes is very similar to what's it called? Kahoot. So I'll just share my screen and then y'all can join. Okay, here. Just wait like 5 minutes for everyone to join, and then we'll start this quiz. It's very short. It's only like 10 questions, and we'll see if y'all picked up on everything. Okay, is everyone here that wants to be okay? Um, if you aren't, message quickly in the chat. If not, I'm going to start in about 10 seconds. So, can you send a link? Yes, I can. Um, okay, we'll wait on some more people. Okay, is everyone here? If y'all are still waiting, message because um, I'm going to start the quiz soon. Otherwise, okay, I'm gonna start it. If you guys want to join later, then just click the quiz. Okay, start. Okay, it looks like nearly everybody is finishing up. So wait a little bit longer for last few people to, and then I'll go over the questions, and then if y'all have any questions, feel free to ask me. Otherwise, that's gonna be okay. I don't know if they're done. Okay, I think we're just about done for now, so we'll go over questions quick. Okay. All right, looks like this one was the most. Which one is not true of organelles? So the answer is what was the most answered? All right, this was the least correct question, I think. So end the game and then go over question. Oh, and congratulations to these people. Okay. Uh, it's like the most missed questions were like question one, surprisingly, just about half right for all of them. Okay, let's go over some of these questions. So first of all, you guys must realize that for any particular cell in the human or in any other organism, organelles, the amount of organelles and the type, as well as the like particular organelles in a cell, they may all be different. For example, a muscle cell has a significantly different kinds of organelles compared to a liver cell. A muscle cell may have a lot more mitochondria because it needs a lot more energy, while a liver cell may have more like Golgi PR because it has to secrete and deal with a lot of like it has to produce a lot of secretions and like clean the blood, right? So the best answer for this one is this because organelles do perform, like I said, particular function for a cell, right? And they are uh, membrane enclosed structures. So this is the best answer. Okay, next one. All right. The largest structure inside of an animal cell. It's usually the nucleus. In some cases, it may be different organelles, but it's usually the nucleus. The DNL or the DNA is a very large structure, technically speaking, but the nucleus contains all of the DNA. So by logically, the nucleus would have to be larger. And by when I refer to the DNA as being large, I mean that it's a very long molecule. It's very thin, but it's a very long molecule. But the nucleus physically is probably large. Okay, looks like a lot of people got this wrong. So the wrong answer that you guys chose is actually the function of another related organelle called the chloroplast. And the mitochondria is almost opposite of the chloroplast and what it does. It takes organic molecules and breaks them down. Okay, so the answer is this. Okay, it looks like only a couple of y'all got this wrong. Um, yeah, I went over this directly. Smallest unit of life. I was emphasizing this throughout the entirety of the lesson, so I hope you guys understood it, but the smallest unit of life is the cell. Okay. The function of the cell nucleus, like I said, it can be thought of as the CEO. It controls the cell functions, and the remove waste products usually refers to a lysosome, another organelle, and produce energy usually refers to the mitochondria. Okay, next question. So only one of you guys got this wrong. The powerhouse of the cell, everyone knows, mitochondria. Okay, where do new cells come from? So cells, one of the basic tenets of biology is that cells only come from other cells, okay? And goes hand in hand with the idea that the cell is the basic unit of biology. Okay. It's like a lot of you guys got this wrong. Cells, a lot of cells, like if you look around you, to any person, to any living organism, it's obvious that you can see that many cells carry out different functions. For example, your eye cells, at the surface of your eye, your cells, their function is just to be see-through. But your skin cells have a completely different function, right? It's to like block bacteria and provide an outer covering for the human, right? So cells carry out very different functions. And for the final question, it is the nucleus. So I mentioned that the DNA is stored in the nucleus, not the ribosomes. The ribosomes contain a related form of nucleic acid called RNA. And the mitochondria actually do contain DNA, but they don't direct the cell activities. It's the nucleus that directs the cell activities. And lysosomes, I've mentioned that they digest organic molecules and remove waste products. Okay, that's all for this quiz. Congratulations to our winners, and yes, that's about it for today's class. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat right now. So if you have any questions or concerns, just email me. Other than that, that's it for today's class. Just stay tuned for the next few classes where we'll be going through some classical genetics. There will be no homework today, and thank you all for being here. And that's it for today's class. Okay.